Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is the channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners, we're going to look at the line of demarcation. Line of demarcation is really important if you want your harmony to be intelligible. It's really important to creating well-balanced chords, and it's extremely important because you want to make sure when you're orchestrating the brass, for example, that you don't make decisions that are going to undermine the decisions you already made in the strings. Before we begin, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. One, I started doing orchestration tutorials directly on my website, barneyjmusic.com/orchestration. The first episode is how to build chords, and we look at the essential harmony, we look at doing piano reductions, and finally, I take harmony and I orchestrate it in two different examples and we compare and contrast. Also, don't forget that the source of good orchestration is a really good level in harmony. It's not an intellectual understanding. All right, so when you want to orchestrate or when you just want to analyze someone else's orchestration, the first thing is you have to know the harmony. So we look at the key signature for Beethoven and we see 3 sharps, we see an A major chord right away. Okay, so that's the one. The chord that we really want to look at is measure 3. And I see a G sharp. Automatically, that's the leading tone. We're on a 5 chord, so I'm going to be looking for the B and the E. Okay, I look up and down. Okay, I see the B and the E, so we're on a 5-6. Now, could this be a 5-6-5? You know, the 5 is diminished. Okay, so it's a 7th chord. I look for the D, which would be the diminished 5th. I look up and down the chord, and I don't see it. So I know it's just a 5-6. Okay, 3 notes in the chord. Notice how quickly I talked. That was intentional because it actually took longer to speak than it did to notice what the harmony is. If you have trouble recognizing basic harmony, for example, with Beethoven, it really is quite simple, then that lapse is going to really permeate in every aspect of orchestration, and you will find it extremely difficult. It's nothing to feel guilty about. You know, keep orchestrating if you're already starting, but you definitely will need to invest in quality harmony classes or something so that you can analyze Beethoven and you can do orchestration much quicker. Now, let's listen to the strings. Okay, so my question is, what is the bass? So I see we have double bass, cello, and viola on the G sharp. And then notice the upper parts. Okay, so notice that Beethoven has a clear bass, right? He has the G sharp, though in the lower voices, and the upper voices, okay? Notice as well that he has kind of a 3-octave bass, okay? And this is not my personal cup of tea. A lot of German composers, they have a really heavy bass line. Definitely Brahms is kind of egregious when it comes to this. I come from a more French perspective where we want a bass plus léger, as we say it in French. But nevertheless, the harmony is super clear because we have the bass and then we have the upper. Now let's look at an example of poor orchestration. Okay, notice that the bass is a G sharp, but we also have that G sharp in the highest voice, the soprano, in this case, the violin 1. This is what we call a confusion of harmony because each note has a certain function, right? This is a leading tone, so probably going to resolve up to A. So now we no longer have a bass that's doing its own function and a soprano that's doing something totally different. They're kind of morphed and there's these middle voices in between. So it's what we call a confusion of harmony. Now this orchestration on its own, it could work if you're not really doing something tonal, if you're really hearing it that way, but be wary of intentionally doing things different just to be different. Your unique voice is different enough, and it's much better to have like a safe, clean orchestration than trying to be dangerous and edgy. Notice as well that we have a possible incongruency of the tessituras. So I talked about this in a previous video. I talk about comparable tessituras. Low register, cellos in a low register. And here we see that we have the violin 1 in kind of a medium register and the other voices in lower registers. And the question is this really balanced? There's a risk that it's not fully balanced. And again, are you truly hearing this? Now let's look at the woodwinds and the strings. So remember the line of demarcation, it's that G sharp. So we have the bassoons with the lower strings. Sorry, bassoon 2 with the lower strings. And then the bassoon 1 with the upper strings. Okay, so notice that that G sharp is the line of demarcation. That's the highest part of the bass, and thereafter we have the upper partials. Notice as well that the bassoons are split in their function. So the second bassoon is doing the bass function and the first bassoon is doing the upper function. This is perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable, but the most important thing is that that line of G sharp is the line of demarcation and we do not want to put it again afterwards. I want to start talking about the line of demarcation from the perspective of the soprano when you have like a melodic note or kind of a distant note that's part of the chord. But let's just do a quick review of what we just discussed, okay? So when you're orchestrating the bass, you have to ask yourself, what is the bass and what is everything else? In particular, you want to be really clear on what is the highest octave of that bass and making sure that when you orchestrate that you do not put that bass function note in an upper voice and thereby create a confusion of harmony. Don't forget about congruency of the tessituras. So yes, when we orchestrate, sometimes you'll have a dark, bass and like a bright, violin 1, but nevertheless, the tessitura that each instrument is playing it, they have to work together. Finally, if you have fuzziness in your harmonic understanding, then don't forget I have a Fundamentals of Harmony course in which I'm trying to bring that French tradition to English-speaking audiences. So check it out when you have a chance and see if you like the exercises. Now, one thing to mention is that there is never going to be a rule, or almost never going to be a rule, that is one size fits all. So this rule I'm showing you about the line of demarcation, especially for the bass, Beethoven actually breaks it, okay, or has an exception to this in the brass, but I'm going to save that for the end of the video, so I'll catch you then when I review it. Let's look at the strings in this chord from my symphony Help Us on the Way for Orchestra. So you'll remember in a recent video that I did for how to orchestrate tutti passages, I talked about orchestrating in ninth chords, and I mentioned that there was a line of demarcation, and you want to make sure that when you're doing the brass, we're not undermining our decisions in the strings. I wasn't able to go in full detail in that video, but in this portion, I'll be showing you exactly what I meant, so please pay attention. Listen to the chord again. Okay, notice that we have the root and the double bass and the cello as well as the violin 2. Notice that the fifth of the chord is in the violas, it's in the violins, and then we have the ninth at the top of the chord. This is a very traditional and good voicing of the ninth chord, okay? So this is something we learn in harmony. Again, harmony is the source of orchestration. You're going to put the ninth in the highest voice so it's clear and lumineux, as they say in French, and then you put the root as far away as possible. That way it doesn't feel like a dissonance, and we understand the expressive quality of the ninth. It also kind of closely imitates the harmonic series. So notice that the ninth, the violin 1, is our line of demarcation. Okay, so we got to be careful when we do the other groups, the woodwinds and the brass, that we're not putting that B flat above it for sure, and even below, it's going to be much further below. Now let's look at an example of poor orchestration. So here we have the root above the ninths, okay? Now, it is very possible that this orchestration could work in someone else's music, okay? If that's part of your style, if you're really hearing it, there's going to be kind of a rough quality, kind of like they don't really agree with each other. It can work, but it has to be actually what you're hearing. And if you're hearing very tonally, then it's not going to work. It's just going to be a contradiction in of itself. Now, let's look at an example of good harmony. So here, notice that we have the line of demarcation, we have the violin C and the staff, and above it, there's the fifth. Okay, so this, of course, is addressed in harmony exercises, as I keep talking about over and over again. It's really nice to have the fifth above the ninth. It creates spaciousness to the chord. Now let's look at a possible incongruency of the tessituras. So if we're going to do this orchestration, notice the double bass is in a low register. We have the cellos medium low. Viola, violin 2 are in low or lowish registers. The violin 1 is in a kind of medium register. So my question just orchestrationally is maybe the violin 1 is going to stick out a little bit unnecessarily. Certainly you can compensate with the woodwinds and the brass, and by no means is this going to be like a terrible orchestration, but it's something that you kind of have to keep at the back of your mind. Let's listen to the tutti chord. All right, so when you're doing a tutti passage and you have like a special melodic note in the upper voice, then you have to remember the line demarcation. So that line demarcation is that C. So when we look at the woodwinds, okay, we don't see any B flat, the root above the C. So that's really good. Notice as well with the woodwinds that we have F, A flat, C. So it feels like it's an F minor chord, but we're missing the actual root. That's in other groups in lower registers. This is an example of incomplete harmony. Now you may have remember a previous video in which I mentioned you try to have complete harmony, but there's many exceptions, right? Debussy is just Péléas and Mélisande. His only opera is an example of plethora of exceptions, but here as well is an exception. Notice that the woodwinds are the upper partials of the chord, so it gives a nice clarity to the sound, and the darkness of the lower registers is relegated to the brass. So make sure that you don't take any rule to extreme. Now, let's listen to the brass. Here we have complete harmony, okay? So the lower brass have the roots, and then the upper brass have the upper partials of the chords. Notice again, so the line demarcation is that C, and we still maintained it, so we haven't created any kind of confusion of harmony. Also notice the transposition. So when I put the French horns as they will appear for the players, transpose, notice that they are in at the top of the staff. So they're going to be loud, they're going to be full and sonorous, versus how they appear on a C score, they're kind of buried in the kind of middle, give the impression that they won't be super loud. Notice trumpets as well. When you write them transpose, they're pushing above the staff. So it's important when you're orchestrating that you don't become too ideological and just see it in terms of C. It can feel comforting that way because you see the absolute pitch, but it also is very deceptive because with these French horns, it would give the impression that they're not as high as they actually are going to sound. Let's listen to a good orchestration of the brass. So notice that the root is in the trombone and the tuba. It's much lower. And above we have the fifth and we have the ninth, fifth and ninth. Okay, we have the ninth and two different octaves. Okay, but it's far away from the root. So as a section, this is going to sound excellent. Notice as well where the French horns are placed. Notice that they're in the middle of the staff. If you just look at the C piano reduction, you may have the impression that the French horns are going to be rather low, but it is not the case. Also, trumpets have the same orchestration as before. They're pushing above the staff. The trumpets are definitely going to be very prominent in this orchestration. Now let's look at poor orchestration. So the brass on their own sound good, as we just saw. But when we combine them with the strings, it no longer works as well. You'll notice that we have the root in the violin too, and look how close it is to the French horns. It's only a second away. It's no longer understood as a ninth chord. It feels like these two dissonants rubbing against each other. Now, this can work if that's actually what you're hearing, but it's no longer truly a ninth chord. Now let's look at an example of poor orchestration with the strings and the woodwinds. So the woodwinds on their own actually sound quite nice. Okay, we have the root and the bassoon and the oboe, and then we have the ninth at the very top of the chord in the flute. So it's actually going to be really nice orchestration. However, when we combine it with the strings, it no longer works as well. Notice that the root in the oboe is very close to the ninth in the violin one. So all that work we would have put into the strings has been undermined because we focused too much on the woodwinds and forgot about the whole. Also, whenever you have an instrument that's playing out of its natural, kind of normal register, it's good to kind of do a double check. So here you'll notice that I have the bassoons in tenor clef, because that's how it'd be written. And you see right away, okay, that's a delicate region of the bassoons, if it's very light. In this particular chord, it works really well, right? The clarinets are in that medium register where they blend in well. Oboes aren't in that low register where they stick out, and flutes are nice and clear. All right, so now let's talk about orchestrating dissonance. In this example, notice that it's no longer a ninth chord, okay? We have the C in the flute and the violin one going down to the B flat. Listen to the second part of the chord. Okay, just a B flat, technically it's B flat minor, though we don't have the third here. And so the way that this has been orchestrated has clarified that this is not a ninth chord because we have kind of a 9/8 or 2-1, you could call it suspension. We don't know if it was prepared, but it's very clear from this orchestration that it's a dissonance that then gets resolved. For that reason, having the root in all these intermediary voices, right? You have it in the clarinets, you have it in the bassoons, you have it in the violin too. This is not creating any kind of confusion of harmony because the initial C will be understood in retrospect as a dissonance. Now, I want to go back to Beethoven and the exception to the rule, but I want to just quickly mention, just summarize some of the points that we went over. So, one, when you're orchestrating the soprano or any kind of sensitive notes at the top, okay, you got to think about that line of demarcation, what's going to go below, because you do not want to undermine the decision that you made. In particular, you want to know which octave it is in, and also when you're orchestrating other sections like the strings, the woodwinds, the brass, that you don't create something that sounds good in that section, and then as a tutti chord, is not going to work as well. Notice as well the transposing instruments. You want to continually test them out. Okay, this might sound good on piano, but when I put it for the instrument, does it actually sound good? Also, if you're having trouble voicing chords, then you'll know already that the solution is going to be harmony. All right, so let's end with an exception. So this is a chord from Beethoven. Remember, the G sharp is the bass, okay, the leading tone. So we have that line of demarcation with the violas and the bassoons. Notice, however, that the E in the lowest French horn actually fits in between the bass instruments. It is not pushed up with the higher parts. So there are a couple of reasons for this. One, the practical reason is that at this time period, Beethoven didn't have access to valve, trumpets, and horns. He had natural horns, so they could only do the notes in the harmonic series. They had to lip up and down to get the pitches, so it wasn't very flexible. So because of this, he had to make certain compromises. In addition, the main concern here is not having that G sharp in an upper voice like the violin or something like that. So putting the tonic, the E, below it in between doesn't fundamentally alter that. If Beethoven had had access to, valved French horns, maybe he wouldn't have done that. ultimately, the true solution, if you're having trouble with orchestration, is going to be harmony, because you're going to be working on the actual functions of the chords. You're going to be building above and below if you're doing the French style, and it's going to increase your hearing. So if you need to work on harmony, I am doing live tutorials this semester, and I'm posting them on the website, and there is homework that you can do on your own time and get the answers so that you can, petit à petit, as we say in French, you can work on harmony. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.